Epic Originals presents Creepy Cafetorium, Book 8, Joel and Other Joel Find Their Voices. Written by Gina Lovelace, illustrated by Anna Maria Young, performed by Andrea Ems. People are always asking me, Gertie, how do I know if I'm a clone? To which I reply, don't be silly, Gertie version 26.9b, of course you're not a clone. It's common knowledge that we all have a few clones wandering around. What was that? You've never met one of yours? Oh, I'm sure you have. Have you ever been in a movie theater and only you and one other person laughed at something? Well, that was probably one of your clones, who also loves when chickens bobsled. Things are quiet in the cafetorium. The smell of freshly baked cookies is in the air, and no one has gotten trapped in a comic for weeks. But rumor has it that Principal Rodriguez is about to announce something so incredible that it'll make hot ice cream sandwich Wednesdays seem like lukewarm ice cream sandwich Thursdays. Today's story stars Joel and Other Joel. Most people assume they're clones, but they're actually something even more scientifically rare, true best friends. Nothing can separate these two pals, except maybe the dreaded Seat 47. Joel and Other Joel have been best friends since the dawn of time. Well, since the dawn of their time. That's because their moms have been best friends forever. One of Joel's earliest memories was when he and Other Joel were playing in a sandbox together while their moms sat on a nearby bench. The weather is lovely today, Joel's mom whispered. The weather is lovely today, Other Joel's mom yelled. Joel was in diapers, as was Other Joel. They'd been playing with the sand, picking it up, throwing it in the air, and going whoosh, and giggling as it fell back to the ground. When Joel whispered, Dirty diaper, Other Joel looked over at the moms and yelled, Dirty diaper! Joel and Other Joel's mothers rushed over to sniff their little ones' butts, as mothers are known to do, and Joel's mom took Joel to the bathroom to change his diaper. And that was how it started, and continued, every single day of their lives, until one day. Joel and Other Joel were on their way to lunch when a voice rang out through the loudspeakers. Hello, students, Principal Rodriguez said. I'll be sharing some exciting news at lunch today. You won't want to miss this. Joel perked up. School was usually fun. After all, his best friend Other Joel was always by his side. But this big announcement might make school even more fun than it already was. Like the time a water pipe burst and the whole school was a water park for the afternoon. No one really knew where the water slides came from or where they disappeared to after the water dried up. Or the time Les One opened the refrigerator door and a clown car sped out, and then a clown and his 11 cousins ate the last dozen chicken patties. Who knew what today would bring? I'm really excited about this big announcement, whispered Joel. I'm really excited about this big announcement, yelled Other Joel. We're all excited about this big announcement, Mr. Noodle Strudel said as he passed the boys, but you both get a warning for yelling. Other Joel cowered. He was always sticking up for his best friend Joel by repeating whatever he said, since Joel seemed to be shy with his own thoughts. When the lunch bell rang, Joel and Other Joel headed to the cafetorium. When they got there, Remy was in the middle of a story. Because he was always in the middle of a story. And then the teacher told me that I needed to change my ending from happily ever after to something new and different, Remy said. I find most happily ever after stories to be antiquated, Jeremiah said, using one of his new vocabulary words. Wait, Remy said, that's not the end of the story. Joel giggled. Other Joel laughed loudly. Liz Dawson shoved a chicken patty. It was the first one off the grill that day into her mouth. But your stories never end, Remy. Knock, knock, Phyllis said. Who's there? The entire table asked. Orange, Phyllis said. Orange who? Esme asked. Aren't you all glad that Remy didn't get to tell the rest of his story because I interrupted with this knock-knock joke? Uh-oh, Esme said, reaching for her helmet. A funny joke from Phyllis meant trouble was around the corner. It's okay, I can still tell it now, Remy said. Joel wanted to listen to Remy, but he was thinking about the big upcoming announcement. I wonder what Principal Rodriguez is going to tell us, Joel whispered. Other Joel nodded as he promptly shouted, I wonder what Principal Rodriguez is going to tell us. Mr. Noodlestrudel walked past them and said, "That's your second warning." I hope it's that we're going to have a nice quiet afternoon in the cafetorium, Esme said, buckling her helmet. I hope it's that we're going to have a talent show. I want to tell more of my new jokes, Phyllis said. Whatever it is, it's clearly very crucial information, Jeremiah said. As Joel and other Joel walked to a trash can to throw away their banana peels, Principal Rodriguez's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. Students, please take a seat on the bleachers so I can make my big announcement. Let's sit in the front row so we can hear really well, Joel whispered. Let's sit in the front row so we can hear really well, other Joel yelled. Joel looked at the front row and thought about which seat to sit in, wanting to avoid seat 47. Just last week, Remy had told the story about how nobody ever sat in seat 47. No one was sure why, although it took Remy the whole lunch period to get to that part. But since Remy said no one had sat there in 600 years, Joel didn't want to start now. I'll sit here, Joel whispered, and started to sit in seat 49. But Remy didn't hear him and sat there first, bumping Joel over to seat 48. Other Joel hesitated. To stay next to his best friend, he was going to have to sit in seat 47. But he only thought about that for 0.000001 of a second before dropping into seat 47 and yelling, I'll sit. Joel waited for other Joel to say, here, but the word never came. Joel looked to his right. Then he looked around the cafetorium, back to his right, under the bleachers. Other Joel was gone. After flying through the air for exactly 4.248967 seconds, other Joel landed exactly where he had started, in seat 47. Here, he finished as his butt settled on the bleacher. Other Joel looked to his left and was immediately confused. Where was his best friend Joel? He looked around the cafetorium, then back to his left, then under the bleachers. But Joel was gone. Looking around the cafetorium, other Joel noticed that things were weird. He inspected his seat, which didn't say seat 47. Instead, it said seat 74. And in place of the clock that always read 2:14, there was a sundial that read 4:12. While other Joel tried to figure out how a sundial could tell time indoors, a baby that looked just like Gertie walked by, pushing a broom. Her hair was twice as tall as her body, and a toy cat and rattle stuck out of her curls. Baby Gertie passed him with a nod of her head and a goo-goo gaga. Other Joel didn't know what to think. That wasn't entirely unusual for him, since he usually relied on Joel to do the thinking. But before other Joel could even think about what to think about, a green tentacle appeared. Other Joel panicked. He was relieved to see Jeremiah running over to him. Not remember? Jeremiah said. Squid Arm Baker, give cookies. Other Joel was surprised. Jeremiah was proud of his big vocabulary, so why was he speaking in sentences that didn't make any sense? The fist at the end of the green tentacle opened up, and there sat a freshly baked chocolate chip cookie. Jeremiah took the cookie, and the squid arm slunk away under the bleachers. Other Joel wanted to thank Jeremiah for coming to his rescue, but he also felt very nervous doing something like that on his own. So instead, other Joel yelled, Squid Arm Baker, give cookies! Mr. Noodlestrudel ran over to them. Other Joel braced for his third warning. Here are a few extra cookies, Mr. Noodlestrudel said, just for being you. Remy, Phyllis, and Esme all walked by, holding their lunchboxes. Liz Dawson came too, carrying a plate of green jello. Ready to go eat on the ceiling? She asked. Other Joel was beyond confused. First, Liz Dawson never ate jello anymore. Second, Mr. Noodlestrudel was never this nice. Third, how on Squid Arm Baker, give cookies! Mr. Noodlestrudel ran over to them. Other Joel braced for his third warning. Here are a few extra cookies, Mr. Noodlestrudel said, just for being you. Squid Arm Baker, give cookies! Mr. Noodlestrudel ran over to them. Other Joel braced for his third warning. Here are a few extra cookies, Mr. Noodlestrudel said, just for being you. Remy, Phyllis, and Esme all walked by, holding their lunchboxes. Liz Dawson came too, carrying a plate of green jello. Ready to go eat on the ceiling? She asked. Other Joel was beyond confused. First, Liz Dawson never ate Jell-O anymore. Second, Mr. Noodlestrudel was never this nice. Third, how on earth were they going to eat lunch on the ceiling? And fourth, where was Joel? And why didn't anyone realize he was missing? But when Phyllis, Jeremiah, Esme, and Liz Dawson all yelled, "Ready!" and usually Chatty Remy quietly gave a thumbs up, Other Joel did what he did best. "Ready!" he yelled. And then he watched as everyone jumped really hard and landed upside down at tables on the ceiling. Other Joel did the same and came to sit right alongside them. "Favorite things," Jeremiah exclaimed. "Who'll go first? Share all." "My favorite thing about today is that I'm eating egg salad. Want to know why eggs don't make jokes? They'd crack up," Esme yelled. "Don't make jokes," Phyllis said. "Lunch is meant to be serious." "My fave," Jeremiah said. "Got D+ on words test, so better than last test." Remy held up a painting of a tree, pointed to it, then gave a thumbs up. "My favorite thing is obviously Jell-O," Liz Dawson said. "I know, I eat it every day, but it really is quite delicious." Everyone stared at Other Joel. Other Joel stared back at the upside-down versions of his friends. It was his turn. But how was he supposed to share a favorite part of his day when Joel wasn't here to answer first? The moment Joel realized his best friend was gone, he panicked. Suddenly, nothing else mattered, not even Principal Rodriguez's big announcement. "Help!" Joel whispered, but he was drowned out in the buzzing cafetorium. "Help!" Joel whispered again. Still, no one heard him. Mr. Noodlestrudel waved one hand in the air. "If you're not all in your seats in the next 15 seconds, everyone gets a warning, except those of you who already have one strike. Then you're on strike 2, except those of you who already have 2 strikes." Joel started to sweat. What else could he do? He'd never spoken up or raised his voice in his entire life. Principal Rodriguez joined them in the cafetorium. "I'm going to make the exciting announcement in 10 seconds, she said. "So, 10, 9, 8.945679, 8.754538, 8.56432. Joel tapped Remy on the arm. "Where's Other Joel?" he whispered, but the commotion around them was too loud. "I can't hear you," Remy said, "which reminds me of the time Gertie was having trouble hearing me from inside a water balloon. Remember the time we were all trapped in water balloons and Gertie had to pop us to safety? Exciting announcement in 5.234893 seconds, said Principal Rodriguez. For the first time in Joel's life, he knew he would have to be loud. He had to make someone understand that his best friend was missing, but he didn't want to yell. Exciting announcement in 2.01945667 seconds. If the last thing that Other Joel had done was sit in seat 47 and nobody knew what seat 47 did, then maybe whatever had happened to Other Joel had happened because of this weird unknown seat. Joel thought about his best friend and sat his butt fully on seat 47. And then he disappeared, too. After swirling through the air for 4.248967 seconds, Joel came to a full stop. He looked around the cafetorium and was immediately puzzled. There was a ton of noise, but there wasn't a single kid around. He saw a sundial in the place where the clock usually hung. Then his eyes continued upward, and he saw kids on the ceiling. Where am I? How can I make it up to the ceiling? What dimension is this? What if Other Joel isn't even in this dimension? He was breathing almost as fast as he was thinking. Joel looked down just as a green tentacle reached out toward him, its tip forming a tight fist. Help! Joel whispered. But just like in the regular cafetorium, nobody heard him. Joel was at his lowest low. He was in another dimension, wondering if he'd ever see his best friend, or any of his friends again, and he was about to be attacked by a monster. He couldn't rely on other Joel to help him fix this the usual way, so he figured out how to do the one thing he'd never done before. "Help!" Joel screamed. "Help! I need help! Please send help!" Other Joel looked around the ceiling. He could have sworn he heard Joel, but not regular Joel, a loud version of Joel. "Help!" the voice screamed. "A monster is trying to capture me!" Other Joel looked down from the ceiling and saw the tentacle working its way toward Joel. The upside-down versions of his friends still stared at him, waiting to hear what he'd liked so far today. Other Joel finally had an answer. "My favorite thing is that I'm going to help my best friend," Other Joel said. Then he jumped as hard as he could, landed on his feet on the cafetorium floor, and ran over to Joel and the tentacle. Other Joel put his hand on his best friend's shoulder. "Don't worry, it just wants to give you a cookie," he said. The monster's fist opened to reveal a cookie. "Other Joel, I found you!" Joel yelled, hugging his friend. "I'm so happy," Other Joel said. The two of them stared at each other for 3.745928 seconds before they both spoke at the same time. "Wow, it's really nice to yell!" Joel yelled. "Wow, it's really nice to say something on my own," Other Joel said. "Maybe we can take turns?" "With who whispers?" Joel yelled. "And who yells?" whispered Other Joel. Then, as the two high-fived, they felt the monster squeeze them into a hug and pull them under the bleachers. In 2.543699 seconds, Joel and Other Joel were back in the regular cafetorium. And as I just said, they heard Principal Rodriguez announce to the room, "Students should not repeat the special surprise, and teachers aren't allowed to repeat it either."
"Yes, Principal Rodriguez,"
the students replied, standing up from their seats. "Oh, man," Other Joel whispered as they followed everyone out of the cafetorium. "I can't believe we missed the surprise." "I bet Remy will tell us," Joel yelled with a big smile. Yelling really was fun. Once all the students were gone, Gertie, Baby Gertie, and the tentacle reset seat 47 with an inflatable hammer and a bucket of glitter slime. "You were right," Gertie said to Baby Gertie. "A little scare did help Joel and Other Joel find their voices. Every 600 years or so, that seat 47 really comes in handy." "Goo goo gaga," Baby Gertie said. "Remember, it's your turn to bring orange slices to the next softball game," Gertie told the baby version of herself. "Goo goo gaga," Baby Gertie said as she crawled on top of seat 47 and disappeared. "I hope she doesn't bring jars of creamed sweet potatoes again," Gertie said to the tentacle as it passed her a cookie. "That baby is unpredictable." Look for these books from Epic. Time Buddies, Book 1. Unicorn Island, Book 1. Available now. To read more, visit getepic.com.